This is the Amidon Planet Podcast, episode 52. I'm your host, Joel Amidon. Thank you for joining me on this never-ending quest to figure out how to teach better. Today on the podcast is the final episode in the book club and a bonus series that we started this summer. We've had a few interruptions along the way. We started the Transition Years podcast series that's going to be airing on this feed. Also, we tragically lost Bob Moses, civil rights activist and mathematics education activist, who passed away in late July. Had a chance to talk about his life and legacy through his book, Radical Equations, and had a conversation with Dr. Eris Winger on that. You can check out episode 50 if you missed that. But we even actually just read a little bit about Bob Moses this past week in my class here at the University of Mississippi, and just, think about what he talked about with math being a gatekeeper to citizenship, and then also thinking about some of the stuff that he talks about in the book, and just really honoring the experiences and mathematical sense-making of students, and thinking about it, well, what does that look like translated into school mathematics, and wanting to help as many people as possible get through that gate, and to raise the floor of where people's mathematics experiences could be. And again, if you've never read Radical Equations and you have any sort of interactions with math education, which most of us do, that's a great book to think about. So anyway, going back, we're in the book club and a bonus series, and so again, this is the last episode in that series. And so this the book club and a bonus series were all about giving materials that were accumulated around these book clubs that we did through the Teaching Math Teaching podcast. So we have a decent amount of material, definitely a decent amount of materials for this, especially this book. And this book is Teaching Math at a Distance by Theresa Wills. She has a lot of materials just in general on her website, which we'll link to in the show notes. But then we have all the book chats that we have, and then her book in general is pretty powerful with regards to thinking about teaching math using virtual means. And then I'm taking some of those principles and then putting them into my own teaching now, so what kind of tapping into this idea of resilient teaching, so that if modalities need to change, which I'm in Mississippi, and if you want to learn a little bit about mathematics, look at the numbers around Mississippi. And if there's a chance we could go virtual, like, I'm ready. Like, my teaching is resilient. And so taking some of those principles of resilient teaching and knowing that no matter the modality, I'm going to be okay with regards to my teaching. Face-to-face is, I love face-to-face, and I want it to be face-to-face, but if it's not, my teaching can hold up. And I think some of the principles that Theresa teaches in her book, Teaching Math at a Distance, is helps with that. But last time in this series, we talked about the Thirst, which is the autobiography of the Charity Water founder and CEO, Scott Harrison. So that was the bonus part. And I shared a little bit on the podcast about the Transition series, or Transition Years podcast series that we're airing on this feed, which focuses in on providing better mathematical experiences for all students in the last 2 years of high school and the first 2 years of post-secondary education. That effort is being facilitated by Dr. John Staley, so we had a great conversation with him. So that was on the last episode. And also being facilitated by the good folks in the Launch Years Mathematics Organizations Leadership Network and the Launch Years Initiative at the University of Texas at Austin Charles A. Dana Center. You can check out amidonplanet.com/transition years for more information on those efforts and all the great programming being created for this initiative. So, and again, anyone that's interested in those transition years, that's going to be awesome. I mean, the podcast details all the different stuff that they'll be doing, and I think there's lots of great information there on how to better the math experiences for those going through the transition years. You can also subscribe to the Amidon Planet podcast if you're looking for more. So the next time a episode of the Transition Years pops up, it'll show up in your podcast feed. This week, the featured book club, and again, I've already mentioned this, is Teaching Math at a Distance, Grades K through 12, A Practical Guide to Rich Remote Instruction by Theresa Wills. Again, if you've listened to this podcast, especially last summer when I had Dr. Jen Wolf on, we talked about all the different things on how to teach online better, and a lot of the content that Jen shared with me was from Theresa, so it was pretty awesome, like eventually getting to meet Theresa, virtually obviously, and having the book club with her about her book and all the different things that she has going on with regards to supporting good math teaching online. And so that book club, the culminating episode is what you're going to hear at the end of this podcast, at the end of this podcast episode, we're going to share the Teaching Math Teaching podcast episode, which was the wrap-up episode to that book club. But then again, at the show notes for this episode, which would be amazonplanet.com/episode 52, you'll get all the materials that we have. So there's a flyer that has the breakdown of how we read the book and the sessions of the book chats that we had. Dusty Jones joined for a lot of those. So it's Theresa and Dusty Jones. Theresa Wills, the author, and Dusty Jones from the Teaching Math Teaching podcast joined for a lot of these conversations. So we have a bunch of conversations. So there's each of the chat sessions. You can access them on Facebook and on YouTube. So either one that works for you. And you can see the conversations that we had around the content of that book. And then you also get pointed to all the content that Theresa has on her website. So she has this Mather Days thing where she records her going through a messy task, a good high level, like open-ended task where, you know, the kinds of tasks that you want your students to get experience with and thinking about and struggling with, you know, that productive struggle. So you get to see that. And so anyway, lots of great materials, lots of great stuff exposing you to that. I'll stop talking because you'll hear more about it in the culminating episode that will air at the end here. As for the bonus, I'm going to do some shameless self-promotion. So I started another podcast. You're like, Amadon, take a break, man. Yeah, we started another podcast. Myself and Dr. Ann Monroe at the University of Mississippi, we started a podcast called The Teacher's Journey, Mile Markers on the Road to Better Teaching. And it really is, it's about documenting the stories of teacher development. So here at the University of Mississippi, we do portfolios. And anyone that has an accredited program, most likely you're doing some sort of portfolio where you're having students gather their meaningful experiences on their development as a teacher. Now, I was at the University of Wisconsin when they first started this idea of portfolios. I think there was a law called PI 34 maybe, where portfolios were going to be implemented. We didn't actually, my class didn't actually have to do portfolios. And so we but they were like piloting them. So we got the chance to like see it, and you had to like use Dreamweaver, which was a decently complicated program to create the portfolios, but they had a template. They had all these things that kind of helped us create it. But I know during the program, I didn't actually understand what it meant to really grab this portfolio. I didn't know, maybe if I wasn't, my mind wasn't developed enough to really think about how am I growing as a teacher. Now, looking back, I can identify all these mile markers of my development. So what we're trying to do is help create this sort of DNA, help support the DNA of what does it look like to document mile markers of development as a teacher, and think about like, what are these amazing, and what's cool is they're all story. There really is, it's capturing stories. And so that's what we're really trying to do with the portfolio, is capture stories. And so I've seen them, and my colleague, Dr. Ann Monroe, has seen them in our coursework where we're trying to get students to document or think about their own development as teachers and to put those things in their portfolio. So what we want to do is support that work through the podcast, because, hey, let's document these stories. We can connect to the portfolios and can really show what does it look like to do this work well. And so my experiences after being an undergrad in the program was to then come back and I did my doctoral work at the University of Wisconsin, and I supported teachers in developing portfolios, and then brought that sort of understanding about portfolios and development, and thinking about how do we best grow as teachers, and bringing that to the university. So that's what we're kind of doing. We're doing this reflective sort of approach to development, and thinking about a good teacher is one that a good person is something that you do something, you think about what you did, you think about how you might get, like how you can grow and learn from that experience, and then put that into play as you go and engage in that thing again. So whether that's teaching or being a salesman or a basketball player, whatever you're trying to do, if you're engaging in reflective practice, you're doing pretty good. I think even in that Outliers book, was it Outliers, where Malcolm Gladwell talks about the 10,000 hours. It's not 10,000 hours just period. Like if I just spent 10,000 hours sitting in front of a piano, I'm not going to be an expert pianist. But it's like that deliberate practice, right? And I think that's what we're really talking about here is like, what does that deliberate sort of reflective practice look like, and how do we document it? And so that's what the podcast, the Teacher's Journey podcast is, the Teacher's Journey Mile Markers on the Road to Better Teaching is meant to document that sort of thing. So we've launched that, and if you're paying attention to @AmadonPlanet on social media, you're going to start seeing some Mile Marker Mondays where we're going to drop podcast episodes. So that's going to be the plan going forward. We've got, I think, 3 of them up now, but we're kind of just rolling out each of them. We just launched the trailer as of the playing of this, or the release of this podcast episode. We just kind of promoted the trailer. Then we're going to promote each episode for 1 week. And then once we have that done, then we'll start putting out new episodes, I think every 2 weeks, what we're going to shoot for. So that's the bonus. It's shameless self-promotion, but this podcast is all about learning how to teach better, and that one's kind of about documenting folks that are, and how the places where they learned how to teach better. And they're putting, again, it's like a historical marker, those green signs you see all over town here in Oxford, those things that say, hey, something important happened here. And that's really what we're doing, is we're identifying those important spots in the development of teachers. So again, that's called the Teacher's Journey, Mile Markers on the Road to Better Teaching. So you can check that out wherever you get podcasts. And that's the end of this shameless commercial for that podcast. So, but without further delay, I want to get into this final episode of the Teaching Math Teaching podcast, No Guilt Book Club series that we did on Teaching Math at a Distance with Theresa Wills. Again, this is the culminating episode of the book club where we kind of review what we talked about and then wrap that up. So it works on its own, but then it also leads into all this other content. And if you're looking for that content, you can go to AmadonPlanet.com/episode 52. All that book club content is there. If you want to use this book club for yourself, that's the whole point of doing this book club in a bonus series. So we've got 4 book clubs available. So we've got this one, we've got the Reimagining Math, the Mathemax Classroom that we did the last episode. We also have the High School Math Lessons book by Staley, Conway, Lawler, and Barry. And then we also have Rough Draft Math with Mandy Jansen. So lots of good stuff there. But enough talking. Here is that episode of the Teaching Math Teaching podcast where we're wrapping up our No Guilt book club of Teaching Math at a Distance by Theresa Wills. Hello, and thank you for listening to the Teaching Math Teaching podcast. The Teaching Math Teaching podcast is sponsored by the Association of Mathemax Teacher Educators. The hosts are Ava Thanheiser, Dusty Jones, and I'm Joel Amadon. Today, we are happy to welcome back Dr. Theresa Wills from George Mason University because she is the author of our Teaching Math Teaching podcast, No Guilt Book Club, that happened this past May of 2021. We read and discussed her book, Teaching Math at a Distance, Grades K through 12, a practical guide to rich remote instruction. Every week, we did a discussion on Facebook Live and YouTube, and are finally wrapping up the No Guilt Book Club with this culminating podcast episode. Welcome, Theresa. How are you?
I am great. Thanks for having me here.
And we have Dusty. Hey, Dusty, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. I am really glad to be here having this conversation. This has been a high point of my summer so far.
Awesome. There we go. And unfortunately, Ava is not able to join us today, but we will carry on. So, all right, we're going to jump right into it. And in the spirit of the No Guilt Book Club, which we've kind of put out there as a way where, hey, whatever level of engagement you can get into it, we just appreciate that. So if you're able to read the book from cover to cover, that's great. If you're able to join in on some of the chats, or maybe this is the first time you've ever heard of this book and you just hit play on the Teaching Math Teaching podcast, and you're like, what are we talking about? So in that spirit, Theresa, can you summarize the main ideas of the book?
Sure. So this book is all about taking all of the things you do in an in-person math classroom and do them online without reducing student voice. They are the ones who are the creators, the investigators, and they're the ones who have a voice in your class. But in the spirit of the No Guilt Book Club, the way it's written is you can pick it up open to any page, and there's about a page and a half reading, and you're like, oh, great. Okay, I can take this and go. And so the no guilt part is, it's one of those things where you don't have to read cover to cover. You can read a section. There's a lot of vignettes in it. And, it's all about taking a small nugget and going and implementing it.
That's pretty darn good. And I would just add on top of that too, like there's a lot of texts and other things that you've referenced in there too. So you're like, the 5 practices. I see. How can I do that in this different modality and stuff like that? So I definitely appreciate that. So can you tell us a little bit, Theresa, about the history of this book, how this book came to be?
Absolutely. So I've been teaching online now for over a decade. And when I say online, I mostly mean synchronous courses. It started off with this kind of old school platform that it did have video, but everyone was really pixelated in it. So we didn't even have video. We had voice and microphone and a text box. And we were trying to communicate. And one thing that was really important was representations. We needed to see how we investigate math problem solving and more. So we started using Google Slides as our main source for it. People would put up representations, whether it was a photo of their work, whether it was their own creation. And that was really the history of where my work was. As the years went on, I really investigated what are things that I do in an in-person classroom and how do I do them in an online class. And one of the ways I did that is through several sections of a math specialist program. I would do one face-to-face with a 10-minute break, and then I had the other online. And I wanted those to be as similar as they possibly could in terms of investigation, representation, student communication, and student voice. So this was kind of my background of where I came into this. Being completely engrossed in this online learning and making this, my preferred style of teaching was, beneficial when the pandemic came and people were trying to figure out, how do I have investigations? How do I have students showing their representations and having a voice in my math class? One of the first things I did is I started doing a lot of professional development for basically anyone who wanted to hear what I had to say. I also went on Global Math Department. They had one last night, actually. But they have some great PDs, and I was able to talk with them. Corwin, Aaron Mellett Corwin contacted me and said, hey, can you get this all down in a book? And I was like, yeah, I've been writing about this for a while. Let me, condense it in here. And so that's kind of how it came to be. It came from a lot of experience, a lot of written papers that people didn't really have an audience for yet. And then when it was time to write the book, there was finally a place for it.
Yeah, this is, maybe a shout out to Corwin. Like, this is our second Corwin book. Then they're doing some good stuff, like reaching out and getting some stuff that people really want. So this is good. So you got the history of the book. And so then we had we had a chance to do when did we do our original podcast? We did it in January, I believe we had a conversation, January, February, somewhere around there.
Yes.
And we're like, we gotta talk about this book. And so we had the book chat, again, book chats all throughout May. And so with those book chats, there's a combination of us three in a virtual room every now and then. And then we had some people online that were sending us some questions too. So what were some highlights from those weekly book chats? And Dusty, you're going to get a chance to do this one too. So everyone's going to have some highlights, but sorry, Theresa, I cut you off.
Oh yeah, no. I think one of them was just chatting with people about, okay, I bought into this. Now, how do I actually do it? And then that part was, relatively easy to talk about the advantages of Google Slides and how you share something through editing. But what really came out of it is the pedagogy. So my pedagogy is the exact same, whether it's in person or it's virtual. And so one of the highlights there was really kind of bringing out that pedagogy and being able to communicate with people that it's the same thing. Let's just figure out the little modality feature. So that was kind of the main one that popped out for me. And the other was being able to share the great resources where my pedagogy has changed. You mentioned the 5 practices already. Jennifer Lump's book was the ideas for chapter 9, and that is Math Workshop. And every chapter I kind of start off with like, hey, this is the book, this is the researcher, this is the author that informed my instruction in an in-person class. And now here's how I'm going to take it online. So I hope that I did their work justice and bringing the pedagogy there, and then just kind of talking people through how I've adapted it to the online space.
So I think the highlights that I had personally as we had these chats were being able to reflect on the different online teaching experiences I've had in the past. I've taught online for maybe 3 or 4 years now, but in the last 12 months taught in a lot of different modalities, in synchronous, in asynchronous, in events where we have some people in the room physically and others remotely, synchronously, and going through the process of thinking, okay, I know I could have done X better. And this book gave me a lot of ideas on how to do that. But what was nice about the book chats is it wasn't me sitting there thinking and beating myself up like, oh, I could have done this better, but being able to bounce some ideas off of some other people and thinking about, okay, yes, next time we can try this. Or in my next online class that I'm teaching is asynchronous. What are some ways that I could take these ideas of how to teach well, like you mentioned, Theresa, keeping my pedagogy the same and using keeping the pedagogy the same and just using these different tools. It's sort of like, you made me think of how I've been playing the guitar for about 20 years. And I just recently started to learn how to play the bass guitar. And I'm trying to think, okay, how can I use my guitar knowledge to play the bass guitar and not try to think of this as some monumental. In 20 years, I might be good at the bass guitar. I'm not really that good at the guitar anyway, but how could I use this knowledge and keep my core, my, what do we call it? My non-negotiables. How can I hold on to those and still deliver good instruction to my students? So I really appreciated that conversation and those ideas that just kind of keep me thinking throughout the month as we were reading this book.
I had like a few different highlights too as well, and like some of the language that you used, Dusty, the non-negotiables and things, made me think about the just the framework for how you set up. Like the whole book kind of sets up to a point where it's like, hey, before we even think about this stuff, let's think about what are the norms and how are we going to like set the stage and the foundation for our classroom. Throw in a few more metaphors or whatever, like set that background to like, okay, this is now what we can put some other things on. Now we can think about, okay, so strategies and like different things we could do to both strategies for facilitating interactions amongst our students, to think about diving into tasks, like all these sorts of things that we can then use that can then lead into building up these math workshops. And like all these things like led up to the kind of the background of your thinking as a teacher that, you can kind of see, even despite the modality, like it kind of seems like, Theresa, maybe this is like the thinking behind that you have going into a class, no matter what, that, hey, these are the things that you need to consider going into teaching of any class. And so I really appreciate that. Again, I love the books where you kind of get behind the scenes and into the thinking of someone and thinking like, okay, what do I need to do in order to do this well or with excellence? And then I really appreciate I got my little tabs here of all the different strategies where at the beginning of a chapter on strategies, you label like, hey, here's all the strategies in the chapter. Here's a nice table so you can kind of see like what might your needs be and what do they do and what are the different categories you lay out with it, like complexity level, delivery methods, student technology modalities used, interactive slide features, all these certain things. And the fact that on your website, you've got all sorts of different resources that you can use with a lot of these strategies as well. And then finally in chapter 9, one highlight that I wanted to put out from the chat is we talked about you would name some ways to do the learning stations. And you had this sentence that really sticks out to me. here are a few examples that you can modify to help reimagine your math class online. And it's like you do all this stuff to set up like, hey, here's some things you can do. But then it's like this sliding it back across the table and be like, but it's up to you. Like, you need to think of like, what is your classroom all about? What are the principles? What is the foundation you've laid? And then thinking about how do you use these things that we've put in, that you've put into the book in enacting your own classroom. And that's what I like, is like, you've opened up possibilities. And I think that's where, we talk about the timing of talking about this book, like, it's a year late. Like, no, maybe it's right on time. And thinking about, we all now have the vocabulary. As Dusty said, we talked about synchronous, asynchronous, and all these different, even modality. I don't think I'd ever used modality before this year much, but thinking about all those different things, that we now have the language, and we now have like or even the need, like, I need to have different ways of interacting in a online, or in even a face-to-face space. I can use these sorts of things to accomplish the goals that I have for my classroom. And so I just appreciate that whole reimagining your math class line over and over again, and like thinking about what does it look like to do the things that you want to do using some of these things I put out there, or even to jump off of these things and think about your own ways in order to, again, accomplish the goals that you have. And so that was one of my highlights.
And, some of the things that you bring up there goes back to my background, as I will forever identify as a math coach, no matter what role I'm in. And what you just mentioned there is the heart of this, that not only do I recognize that there are different types of teachers out there, but I'm going to value that people are different than me. They have different things that they're going to value in their classroom. So what I try to do is give a glimpse of it, and then say like, and these are the reasons I did it. So, in the early parts, when I'm talking about what are the protocols that I use in my classroom, I'm going to bring up safety as one of them, and be very clear that this is a non-negotiable for me, and here's how I address it. And when it gets into other things that may or may not be non-negotiables, I'll go ahead and call it out. And part of that is naming it. So, as a coach, when I work with another teacher, I'll ask them like, hey, what do you want your perfect classroom to be like? And as they describe it, what I'm really doing is I'm rephrasing in pedagogical terms. I'm renaming it. Okay, you want structure. You want student voice. You want this. Great. Now I know what resources to go to support you with this. So that's exactly what the book's doing. It's naming it so that you can pick it up and say, oh, wait, I do want structure. Where's the parts with structure? Let me grab those pieces. That's going to really work for me. And so as a coach, I'm always going to recognize that people learn differently, and their needs are different, and their goals are different. And so being able to name it and showcase it is one of the best ways for people to be able to find something that works for them.
Absolutely. So this is the Math Teaching podcast. And so we kind of talk this is getting to that, tapping into your inner role of being the math coach always and forever. And so thinking about that, and thinking about how would you use this book to teach math teachers, what advice might you have for anyone, or how you use it, or how might you use it, or how might our listeners use it to teach math teachers?
So I teach a variety of teachers. I teach math to the elementary ed folks. I teach the content and pedagogy classes to the secondary folks, and also to in-service math specialists. So I've got kind of three categories that I'm teaching courses in at George Mason. And specifically for my pre-service teachers, I like them to look at vignettes in videos. And I want them to take those apart. What would you have done here? Why would you do this differently? What did they do, and what came of it? And so part of this is really bringing out vignettes. And then one of the things, so I think we'll get to on my website, I have a lot of videos, really raw footage of just a straight 1 hour. Here's what you got. And part of that is so that pre-service teachers can look at something and say, oh, right here, this is what my professor was talking about with asking open-ended questions, but she didn't ask an open-ended question here. She closed it off, and like, why, what was the reason for that? So the vignettes in the books, the videos on the websites are really a great opportunity to pull something apart, unbox it, and talk about why you would do that and why you would do something different. I would love it when pre-service teachers can really glimpse at something and put themselves in those shoes there. And then looking at if you're teaching in-service math teachers who want to be math leaders or math specialists, I really enjoy looking at it through the lens of, here's a vignette of something that happened in a classroom, and you're working with another teacher who wants to do something similar in their classroom. They have different needs to be met. They have different personalities. What things would you transition and what things would you need to change? And so really each vignette is kind of this glimpse of, now you're in that shoes, come on out, what would you change? And when we have those discussions, those reflective discussions, that's going to build upon topics of productive struggle, of open-ended questions, of student voice, of representations. I think I'm listing off those 8 math teaching practices.
Yeah.
But right. So by asking questions about vignettes, as opposed to this theoretical, idea, it's like, no, this is what Miss Henry just asked. Like, what would you do now? And so that's how I use it in teaching, is really dissecting, picking it apart, changing it, and really putting themselves in their shoes and what they would do in that situation.
Yeah, I think that I just want to shout out again to those vignettes, the little yellow parts, and basically at the end of some section of the text where you see like, oh, this is what it looks like to enact this in class. And it's like real language going back and forth between the students and the teachers. And I really do appreciate that part of it, because it makes it come alive, because I don't know, I've got a number of different strategy books, and that is what's missing, is okay, but what does this actually look like? Like, I mean, even to the point of what do I say to start this off if I haven't done these sorts of things in my classroom? So yeah, definitely shout out to those. And then the ability to dissect them and take the pieces apart in order to, all right, what would we do here? How do we act if a student said this to us, or vice versa, if I want, or thinking more broadly about how do I facilitate this if I'm a teacher to do it with my own practice. So Dusty, how about you? How might you use this with your teaching?
Yeah, I like the vignettes a lot. And I'm not going to re-say everything Theresa said, because she said it better than I could, but I like the fact that pre-service, I'm thinking about using this with pre-service teachers.
Yeah.
That instead of them thinking, well, I would use an online activity. Okay, how would you use that? What would you do in there? So these give us some real handles to grab onto, to think how we're doing this online activity, especially for pre-service teachers. I think it would be helpful, but really, I think for all teachers, let me back my sentence up here. I think sometimes working with in-service teachers is nice because they have these teaching experiences already in their past, and they can move on and move forward on those. Whereas with pre-service teachers, sometimes they're thinking about the experiences they had as a student, and maybe they weren't thinking as much about how to teach back when they were a student, say as an elementary school student. But I think these vignettes bring out many different ways and illustrate what we can do with that. And with the vignette, it's really focused on, you're just looking at certain things. So you can get a lot out of a video, but you can also see a lot of things that maybe as the math teacher educator, I don't want the students to think about everything that's there. I want them to think about this 2-page or 3-page conversation that's been transcribed. I also would maybe use this to encourage the students to create some of these things. Like I was looking at which one doesn't belong activity. And these are some things that I'm really, I like myself, and I kind of challenge myself to create a which one doesn't belong. But I think having future math teachers, pre-service teachers create these things, gives them a lot of experiences. And then having their peers critique those things, whether it's which one doesn't belong or one of the many other things that are here, I think could be helpful. So those are a few ways that I would use that. One other way is, I think, in having some conversations with other teachers and looking at the reviews online, like Theresa, I'm on Goodreads, and when I finished reading your book, I marked I've read this book, Teaching Math at a Distance by Theresa Wills, and looking at some other people's reviews, some people were saying, oh yeah, once you get past part one, which is kind of all the groundwork, it gets really interesting. But I think even that part one, setting the stage, like Joel, you had mentioned, before we talk about all the fancy stuff we're going to do online, what are our norms going to be? Or what are the things that are really important to teaching, no matter what the modality is? So I think those are really good things to some good required reading, maybe to think about how we're addressing these things, how we're thinking about student access to technology. This was a big sudden, in March and April in my local school district of last year, it was like, we're doing not much for this month. It's just teachers are doing review, and if you can get onto Google Classroom, which was the local district's platform, you're going to be reviewing these things. Otherwise, come by such and such a building and we'll have a printed off packet for you. And I think you have a great discussion in that chapter of, here are the key things that you need to think about in terms of access and as we move forward. So I think the rest of the book is great, but I think those chapters you intentionally put at the beginning need to be looked at as well, because they just help bring up some good issues.
I got a while. Well, going back to the vignettes, I actually want to see if Theresa, I know you're into technology, obviously, but have you ever played around with either Teach Live or Lesson Sketch or any of the other, like basically a way to recreate practice? You ever played with any of those, Theresa?
I haven't yet. Mm-mm.
So Teach Live has like avatars. It's from the University of, I think, Central Florida. We've had it at the University of Mississippi for a while, where it's like there's an enactor that enacts like 5 students in a classroom, and then like someone teaches to them. And we've done it virtually. We do it we have like a lab where you can do it, where it's basically like you're kind of like a video game, but you're kind of the controller and someone's reacting to you as you teach to them. Or Lesson Sketch is where it's, maybe you've seen, it's like these blue cartoon people where you can create like a classroom. Well, what's cool is like doing some of the things you're talking about with the vignettes, you could use these scripts and almost like scripts in here as like, hey, this is how these students might react to this problem, right? So I'm going to have my pre-service teacher enact this problem. Here are some potential responses you could use given from this, script or vignette. And then that allows for a little bit, diving in deep, and you can record it. And then, so like this video can then be like, I'm like in the vignette, like living it out and trying to see. So that just kind of popped into me, like having, what other ways can you use to like use technology to like dive into an experience to really get that practice of saying like, okay, I've anticipated. Now, how am I going to sequence some of these things? What are the responses I'm looking for? Like, oh, I heard all these different things. How can I build that to whatever my goal is for the class? And like, that's getting to another level. But like having that material in here can allow us to get past the, just classroom management stuff. We can really dive into like the math tasks and thinking about what does that look like in these virtual spaces. So there's a couple different ways to think about how possibly to use the book.
That sounds really cool. I've done a lot of role playing where students will have a script. Sometimes they'll have a secret script from others, and then they'll just role play the situation, act like the student, or say some of the things that are there. And then afterwards, they kind of go back and they reflect on, what are the different pieces they had. But wow. Okay. I'm definitely going to be looking into this all summer long. Now I've got my homework for the summer.
All right, so shameless plug. Amanda Maluski, Joe Sweeney, and from University of Mississippi, and Amanda Maluski from University of Michigan, and I wrote a book called We wrote a chapter or an article in Cite, one of the AMTE sponsored publications. There we go, where we talked about on-ramps to professional practice, and that's where we talk about like Teach Live and lesson sketch. So that could be, again, this material could be, I think, nice to use in conjunction with something like that. And again, until you actually throw a messy task in front of somebody and then seeing like, what are these, man, I don't know what these kids are going to say. Like if we can kind of, narrow the gap between, never doing it and doing it full force, like having some sort of middle space, I think is going to help. Again, it's like an on-ramp, get you up to speed in order to do it in your own practice. So, but again, the vignettes offer the material in order to do that. And I appreciate your inclusion of that within the text. Any other ideas on how we can use this book? If anything else that was not mentioned?
So the last part of the book where you were talking about assessments and homework, I think, did a nice job of reframing what the purpose of assessments and homework are. Because one of the things, I teach in a math department, and one of the things that mathematicians in general are concerned about is that is academic integrity. And I'm not saying other people aren't concerned about that. But when we had the quick transition to online, and even before that, in the slow buildup to trying to offer more things online or thinking about offering things online, homework and assessments, especially summative assessments, were a real sticky point. And I think that, Theresa, you offer some nice ways to reframe what is the purpose of, not reframe, but clarifying the purpose of assessment and the purpose of homework, and offering some things that really fulfill those purposes in a different way than just a straight online application of the 30 problems on a worksheet or the 30 problems out of a book. Now we're asking you to do it online. I think is really helpful, at least to getting someone to think about there might be other ways to do this. For example, I think when we were having the chat and you mentioned photo math, and you were like, this might get me in trouble, but I don't mind photo math, or I like photo math. And yeah, that's a tool that's out there. I think I remember Sam Otten talking about that at some point. Like, this is a tool that's out there, and how can we offer this to students as a resource and still achieve the purposes of students thinking independently, and kind of building their understanding or demonstrating their mathematical understanding. So I think that's worth a read as well for people. It's not that, we're going to have all of these different webcams and a webcam on you from the back, and your browser is only allowing you to look at this one PDF while you click multiple choice answers. That's not where I want to be headed. That's not where I want to use the technology. I want to use the technology to bring out student understanding.
Absolutely. That's where it is. I mean, if we talk to mathematicians, if we talk to people who are doing mathematics and engineering and programming in the field, it's not about memorizing some set of steps. It's about taking what you've learned from those and applying it to this new situation with a tweak. And so you've got to tweak your steps or tweak your regular way of doing it. But yeah, I mean, if we're going to be looking at homework and assessments, we could look at the virtual way as being, oh gosh, I don't have X, Y, Z. But instead, I like to look at it as, gosh, what do we have? We have video. We've never really taken advantage of video in an in-person class, because the problem there is everyone else can see and hear, where now you're kind of private. And so you really can bring out the video. You can bring out images and more. And so when students are the creators of doing the math, it's going to be so much better. One thing that I know we do in the US is we teach all these different types of unit of measurements, right? Like kind of, and how do we do it? Often with proportions, setting them up, cross multiplying, right? Like there's not a lot of hands-on. But now we're asking every kid at home to go get a quarter cup measuring cup and show it to us. And we see all the different ways that it could look like. Oh, those are all different cylinders. Let's check that out. What's the most ideal shape and more? And so it brings the real world like directly into your classroom. You just can't avoid the real world because that's all you got to work with. And so, yeah, so when homework and assessments are taking advantage of the things that you didn't have in an in-person class, you can really get into some investigations and you can look at mathematics as a problem to solve as opposed to arithmetic to do.
Yeah, I love how you made that point initially with your own little vignette at the beginning of the book too. Are you teaching arithmetic? Are you teaching mathematics for understanding? And so thinking about that and bringing bringing that back to, I actually don't know where I was going with that, but anyway, I just appreciate that. I appreciate the difference between that, thinking about the arithmetic and doing mathematics. So I'll stop there.
I have one other comment here with teaching this with math teachers, and early on in chapter 1, I talk about breakout rooms. But the neat thing about that little chart there, so what it shows is the gradual release of breakout rooms when you might have just 2 people in a room for 2 minutes with a really low level task, all the way up to they're used to the technology. Let's increase the size, increase the math task, all the way up to, you know what, I can put 5 kids in a room for 15 minutes and they're investigating the whole time. Like, how do we get there? And I think that's something that pre-service teachers, even in-service teachers, ask all the time is, how do I get my class to this beautiful, wonderful place where I want it to be? What are the steps along the way? And we'll hear this word gradual release, but what does that actually mean? Like, how do I do that? And so one of the things I try to do in that breakout room graphic is bring up, this is one way that I use gradual release. These are the things that I want the students to do at each step of the way. I want you to show that you can be nice to each other. And I was a middle school teacher first. Like, I get that. We've got to show respect for each other. We need to show that we can use the technology. And before we can get to the representations part, we need to make sure that people are comfortable adding images and screenshots and things like that. But it doesn't happen overnight. There are steps. And that's what gradual release looks like. Once pre-service teachers can see it in that frame, they're going to start to see gradual release in all sorts of different areas of their pedagogy.
And that actually reminded me of what I was trying to say before. This is crazy fun. But purpose, like when you talk about with purpose, like the things that you doing with purpose, like this idea of gradual release, like I am doing these things. I'm doing this warm up. I'm doing this, like where you're having them do certain things. I put in a picture of things like that, or the gradual release that you just described. It's to the purpose of getting them to this certain point. It's not just doing a bunch of, disassociated activities. And well, it's even just like the book, there's purpose. Like part 1 is where it is. And then each of these strategies are there to get to this point where we can look at messy tasks. We can do these learning stations. We can do these things. Like there's purpose in there. And so like, it seems like that overall, and even with what you described, is like to have that, like or even with what Dusty was talking about before too, with assessments and homework, it's like, well, what is the purpose of this thing? Is it to like photo math? Like it's allowing them, maybe exposing them to one way to do a task. Okay. So now maybe even thinking of multiple ways to do a task in order to get them to really understand what is the mathematics behind this, or find the photo math like solution and now break it apart, or do it. What would happen if you switch things up or whatever? So anyway, having the purpose, and I appreciate that. It seems like throughout, it's like you're answering that why question over and over again. So as we get closer to the end here, Theresa, what about tips? So like, we talk about these, how would you use this? But like, what are some tips? Like if someone, you see someone in the bookstore, they're picking it up, like, and they're looking at it, and which would be cool. Wouldn't that be cool, Dusty, to like have somebody pick up your book at a bookstore and you're like, hey, guess what? No.
Yeah, that would be cool.
That would be cool. So what would be some tips that you'd have for working with teachers using the book? Like what might be some tips that would be for them?
Absolutely. So the first, most important thing is you learn through doing. That's what the heart of this book is about, is kids doing. So if you're a reader, read it, get excited, get motivated, but then go and do it. So every single activity that's in here, every short little routine, every big, rich task and more, I've got on my website, editable copies of it. So, you don't just go on and you get some stock image that you have to kind of redo for your class. No, instead you go and you get the which one doesn't belong routine, and you put your own images in, and then you go and you do it with your class. You decide, what did I like about that? What didn't? And then you try it again. You try some other things. And so the biggest tip I can say is take advantage of the resources. So when you're learning something new, you can learn how to do it, or you can kind of learn how to make it. But that part is already taken care of for you. So all you need to do is the do it part. Take an idea and go and implement it. You're going to get so much more out of it by actually doing the activity. And you'll be able to relate more with the vignette and the reason why the teacher did what they did. So that tip is just do it. Do the math, do the routine, do the pedagogy, and go back to it afterwards and decide what you liked about it and what you're going to keep for your classroom, because you're a unique teacher.
And another, again, shout out, and we did this a couple times during our chats, was to our episode with Jen Wolf, where she just went through and drew a lot of the resources that you had from that website. And to, when people are like, what am I going to do? How am I going to teach coming up this next year? It's going to be completely different. So a lot of your resources like that, the stuff that you put on your website is gold, from the Mather Days videos and everything that's associated with the book and all those templates. Like I'm going to put a exclamation point on that, is to go check out all that stuff. Because again, like you said, they can either make it or you can do it. And like, if it's already made, like that's, we're not going to be chiseling out some wheels, right? We've already got them. So we can go and use them. So that's excellent. Any other tips?
I think the other tip is you'll notice in some of the things that I've pre-made. So I've got a lot of templates out there, but they are relatively blank. Really, what I do when I make something for students to interact online is I make spaces for their thinking to go. So if I want them to insert an image of a graph, whether they got it from some graph maker online, they sketched it in their notebook, they got it from Desmos, they got it from anywhere, I'm going to make a space and even put on their paste graph here. The neat thing is, when I have 5 different groups working, and they have the same template of paste graph here in its upper right-hand corner, now I'm moving between all 5 groups, and I'm seeing the way that graph changes, because maybe I gave them all a different problem with a different X or a Y intercept. Maybe I'm seeing, which ones are the same. My students, when they're in small breakout rooms, they're like, oh, wait, group 1, they've already put their graph in. We need to do a graph too. So by creating a space, you're helping students to be self-starters. They are the ones putting their work, their thinking, their voice on the slide. You're not spending all night working on slides, because all you did was come up with the space. And it honors them of taking ownership in your class. So the other tip I have is, if you're working really hard on something, ask yourself if that's something that they could be doing. Should you maybe just provide a space that says group 3, your names, and a text box at the bottom that put final group thoughts. How much blank space do you give them? And are your directions clear enough that they can be self-starters, and can they use, other people's work to help them to become self-starters? So those are things that are really important to me as an instructor, is, making sure students know what to do. They know how to be successful, and it's their work going up on the slides.
Anything else? Dusty, do you have any tips? Do you have anything you want to add?
Well, that reminded me of a quote that Theresa has in her book about don't do anything that a kid can do. And so that's a real challenge for me and maybe for many teachers to, one of the things I like to do is I like to help students learn things. And sometimes the bad part of that comes out is where I'm kind of showing them exactly what to do, or that's, how I was as a novice teacher. It's like, oh, you want to know how to graph a line? Well, let me show you. This is how you graph a line. This is what you do. And growing to the point where now I'm asking them questions to where my own kids are like, Dad, I'm not going to ask you this math question because you're not going to answer it. You're just going to ask me a related question. Like if I ask you what's 38 times 2, you come back with, well, what's 40 times 2? And so, but that's, wanting to show them some things instead of that. But I guess one tip that I don't know if this is a tip or if this is just something I like about the book is, Theresa, you're not claiming that these are all of Theresa's great ideas from Theresa at the very beginning, but you've really pooled together a lot of resources that are best practices or that are some really good thinking that people have been putting together for years. And you're just saying, and here's how we apply this, or here's how we can apply this in an online setting. Even back to the initial illustration you gave about, when you had a child, everyone had advice about here's how to raise your child. And then you had a second child, and even all of your good ideas about what worked with the first child are not necessarily going to work with the second child. And I have 3, and Joel, you do as well. I think we could say, hey, the third child, yeah, it's also a new game. Yeah. And so with teaching a class or with teaching online, with each different group of students, things are going to be different, but I just like how you've pooled and help us take all this knowledge that was out there, and you kind of put it in one spot for us to think about a way to do it online. And you gave me the freedom to think, okay, this is what Theresa says, but what do I think? And you're okay with that about how I can apply this to my own classes. So yeah, I really like that.
Exactly. That's the heart of it. I talk in the book about making sure that student voice is honored throughout your math class. Because if you're talking the whole time, you're doing all the learning, not that. Like, how do we honor their voice? And something that's very near and dear to my heart, because I'm always going to identify as a math coach, is honoring teacher voice. And teachers' classrooms are different. But if you can name it, if you can name why this is important to you, you're more likely to continue doing things that you really want to do and be able to identify the things that are maybe your obstacles that you would like to overcome or you would like to change. And so a lot of this is naming it so that you can decide what's the recipe that's going to work for your kiddo, or in this case, your classroom full of kiddos.
I think that's great. That's a great way to put a stop on this episode, but that's not a stop to the learning. Again, the No Guilt Book Club, there's lots of resources out there. There's all the book chats are going to be available, and we'll put links to it into the show notes for this episode. We'll also put links to Theresa's website, and I'm actually going to let Theresa, just anything else to promote? I know we got the book. Obviously, we'll have a link to the book there, and we'll have a link to the website. Maybe a little bit. There's book resources on the website. There's links to the Mather Days. What else is on your website? Because I know you've got a great website.
Absolutely. So I try to make a lot of resources that are tailored for educators to make the tiny tweaks you need to, so they're fully editable and then ready to launch right into your class. I've got on there the Mather Days, which you've heard a couple of times. So theresawills.com/Mather is all about each and every Saturday, which you're welcome to join. We do a 1-hour math block. We start with a little community building, go into a math routine, go into a rich task, and have a purposeful mathematical discussion at the end where we tie together representations. To me, that's my ideal math block. And so I've got 50 recordings, over 50 hours of,
50,
each one a new
50.
task, a new one. So, if you're looking for rich tasks to do in your classrooms, check that out. You're going to get them. I've also got a lot of routines. I'm really into this recently, is figuring out how to adapt routines into this virtual space and give teachers video of it, unedited, completely full of bloopers videos, so you can figure out, what to do in the moment. So everything from number talks, so which one doesn't belong, open middle, notice wonder, see then see, what comes next, things like numberless word problems, clothesline math, and more. What I do is a little shot of each of those things so you can see how to do it online. And the cool part is it's not the same set of activities that I do online. I'll change it up. What is the most important part of unit chat? The most important part is that every kid sees a different unit and they identify what the unit is that they saw. So let me make sure there's a space for every kid to show that. What's the most important thing of the convince me that routine? It's that they have a place for representations. So let me make sure that there is a place for a number line model, an area model, a set model, some of these different parts. And even using the resources from like Estimation 180 is one of my favorite websites. How do I give more student voice? Finding a place for literally every single kid to type in their too low estimate, too high estimate, and just right. And I use color in this so that I can track that. Joel, you're the bright green. I can see which ones you're too low, too high, just right. And I've got some accountability purposes to that there. So those are some things, and many of them came right out of the book. I've just expanded on them. Instead of one problem, I've done 50. Instead of 5 routines, I think we're up to about 20 different routines here. So those resources are there for educators. You got templates, videos, pick them apart, work with your pre-service teachers, ask what you can do better.
Awesome. Well, thank you. This was a fantastic end to this No Guilt Book Club. Thank you for putting the book out there. It's wonderful. Again, I think books are amazing, especially like given all the expertise and connections you made to great stuff that's in math education, just chock full of this, and then on the website too, that we can take advantage of for teaching math at a distance. So just, again, really appreciate your time. Thank you for everything. Thanks to Dusty for joining us as well. So thank you, Theresa, for you. And then thanks again to all of you for listening to the Teaching Math Teaching podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast. We hope that you're able to implement something you just heard. You should be able to implement something. Come on. And take an opportunity to interact with other math teacher educators.
All right. That was it. The final episode in the book club and a bonus series. We're going to start putting out some full episodes in the very near future, probably about 2 weeks from when this podcast is released. And we're looking forward to it. We're looking forward to kind of doing a little bit of rethinking about the podcast, thinking about, hey, how do we really embrace this mission of teaching better? And I think we're going to revisit some topics, but we're also going to dive further into some books, some other things, and, some of the stuff that you like about the teaching or about this podcast, the Amazon Planet podcast. So we're looking forward to that, and I hope that you stay for the ride. Now, if you like this podcast, if you like any of the podcast episodes, share them. And you don't have to share this one, but share the one that you think somebody should listen to. Well, there's 50, this is 52. There's 52 episodes. So if there's an episode that you think someone needs to hear, go ahead and share that one. And then I see who's listening to what, and like if there's more episodes, and then I kind of see, oh, these are the things that people want to hear more of. And so I kind of shapes like where we're going to go in the future. And I kind of see what who's listening to what, or not who. I know who's out there. No, you can see what episodes are being listened to, and that kind of shapes, some of the content going out there. But also, I don't want to limit that. I want to expose you to more stuff. But if there's something that you think somebody else needs to hear, go ahead and share it. That's what's cool about this, is when I hear somebody talking about teaching with these open-ended problems, I'm going to share with them my Teaching with Problems and Problems of Teaching episode. I think that was episode 9, maybe, with about Magdalene Lampert's book. Or if somebody is interested in hearing about Bob Moses, I can share episode 50. And so, again, share the things that you like. That would be the biggest way that you could support this podcast. So that's one thing. Another way you can support the podcast is to subscribe yourself. So if you're not subscribed yet, you hit the follow button, hit whatever, subscribe. So this, the next time we publish an episode, it shows up in your feed. You can do that. You can subscribe to the Amidon Planet download. You can do that at amidonplanet.com. That's giving you resources and updates from Amidon Planet, where the Amidon Planet Podcast Network is ever expanding, as we talked about earlier today. So you're going to get some updates on that, but then any other resources I find out about, I put in that thing. So you can do that at amidonplanet.com. There's lots of join the email list buttons. You can also follow at Amidon Planet on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, or like the Amidon Planet Facebook page. And you can also check out the Amidon Planet store, Amidon Planet Bookshop. Links are in the footer at amidonplanet.com, where you can where all of your purchases support the production costs of the podcast. In conclusion, thank you for listening to this episode of the Amidon Planet Podcast. Thanks to the Teaching Math Teaching Podcast crew for letting me rerun these things on my feed. I think we created some value with some of the resources we put together, but thank you to them. Thanks to Matt Mifflin for the music in this episode. And finally, thank you to all of you out there who are seeking to teach better and be the good in the world by investing in the lives of others. This world is a better place because you have decided to use the gifts you have been given to serve others. Thanks for all that you do. Peace.